Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the 2020 Symposium on Substance Use, Increasing Access to Research, which is a week-long series of events co-sponsored by the Rural Drug Addiction Research Center, the COBRE on Opioids and Overdoses, and the West Virginia Clinical and Translational Science Institute. My name is John Soski. I am a researcher at the Lifespans Transition Clinic, and I am a special projects director at RICARES, which is a grassroots harm reduction and recovery advocacy organization in Rhode Island. So we've been asked to, I'm chairing the panel today, and we've been asked to open the panel with a few remarks on the importance of the topic. Then each panelist will get 5 minutes to introduce themselves and discuss their perspective on stigma, today's topic. And following that, I have 3 questions that I circulated in advance to the panel that I'll pose to them. And after giving them a chance to wrestle with some of these questions, we will open it up in the end for discussion. So thank you for joining us, and I will go ahead and launch into it. Circulating on Twitter today is a clip of Hunter Biden being interviewed on Good Morning America. And I thought about playing it and decided not to because of the technical chaos that would certainly ensue. But I recommend you watch it because the anchor confronts him and says, "In and out of treatment 6 and 7 times. And he looks at her and says, "Can you say that nicer?" And then his next response is, "I sought help for a problem like many people do." And her response is, "For substance abuse." And he looks at her incredulously and it's like, "You are so insensitive." And it's such a brilliant, deflating moment because he's perfectly casual and open, and she is hectoring him, but in a way that is all too familiar for anyone who's lived with addiction or who's in this field. And I wanted to start with it because I really think we might be in a national moment for beginning to wrestle with the significance of stigma against people who use drugs and people with substance use disorders. And I'll just name a few things from the last year. There's been a concerted push by Dr. Nora Valkov of NIDA to put stigma on the national agenda. There's been a major new national anti-stigma campaign launched by Shatterproof. There have been other important public interventions, including a very valuable piece written by co-written by one of the panelists in the New England Journal of Medicine by Aline Kennedy Hendricks. There was the moment in the first presidential debate where President-elect Biden expresses pride for his son, and it produced a national outpouring of emotion of people expressing gratitude for what that meant. And let me say, most importantly, there's the passage of Proposition 110 in Oregon, which marks the first really serious national defeat for the drug war. So all of these together really say to me that something important is happening that we need to pay attention to and talk about. At the same time, when I think about the response to Biden's remarks during the first debate, they also show us how far we have to go. He simply said he was proud of his son. And for such a normal, banal expression of human emotion, we had a national discussion about how extraordinary it was. And that just gives you a sounding of how profoundly people who use drugs and how profoundly people with addictions are dehumanized. When I first started thinking about addiction, when I first started thinking about stigma, I thought I knew what addiction was from my own personal experience and professional experience. And I conceptualized stigma as something like a set of false ideas that we lay on top of addiction and that distort our view of it. And I've really come to see this perspective as wrong. There is nothing in our approach to addiction treatment or recovery that is not completely mediated by stigma. How treatment modalities are structured and imposed, the trajectory of people's experience with addiction. We know internalized stigma produces worse and more dangerous use, treatment outcomes, even how we define addiction and recovery are deeply shaped by stigmatizing ideas. I've come to the point where I simply do not think we have any idea what addiction would be if it wasn't embedded in a society completely structured by stigma. So I really don't, whether you're a clinician, whether you're a researcher, whether a policymaker, I simply don't think you can do rigorous work in this field if it does not have an anti-stigma component. And what I hear in interviews and what I hear from friends regularly is, as devastating as addiction is, the experience of living with stigma is worse. Our responses to addiction do more damage than addiction itself does. But in saying that we're in a national moment, it also means a lot of things are up in the air, and there's a great deal at stake in how we define stigma. And so even as this conversation is becoming more mainstreamed and getting more institutional support, I hear increasingly fatigue, distrust, and anger from activists and advocates around this stigma discussion. There's a lot of fear that it's going to be a superficial discussion that doesn't get at root causes, or even worse, that it once again empowers other people to control the conversation and push out people in recovery and people who use drugs. So I think we face a crossroads. Are we going to have a discussion about stigma that is going to get into the profound institutional and social roots of our failure to address addiction in our society? Or are we going to have a discussion about stigma that really empowers a kind of new version of the implicit bias industry, right? For-profit panels driven by private organizations based largely on pseudoscience that give us a kind of vocabulary to make ourselves feel better, but actually don't address any of the fundamental drivers. And I think the basic question is, who is going to be empowered in this discussion? Will it be people who use drugs and people in recovery, of course, as well as their allies and researchers and other activists? Or is it going to be the existing treatment industry that by and large has failed us? So with that introduction, I would like to now hand it over to my panelists, and we'll simply go down the list of the slides. So we'll start with Aline Kennedy Hendricks, then Kathy Starkweather, then Scott Neufeld, sorry, Scott, and then Austin Brown. So 5 minutes, and take it away, Aline.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel today. I'm excited to be here and to learn from all of you. I am a policy researcher at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. So my perspective on stigma is informed by its implications for policy. That's why I'm interested in stigma. And like 5-minute spiel introduction might have been a little bit different if I hadn't been thinking carefully about the fantastic questions that John sent out ahead of time, because I tend to think about my research work as in several different buckets, one of which is stigma related. And so that work involves measuring stigma through survey research, analyzing the content of news media coverage of issues related to substance use, and conducting randomized experiments that test how different message framing strategies affect stigma. And so the other kind of bucket of research that I do is sort of more traditional in my world, health services research, health policy evaluation, including how we finance services for people with substance use disorder treatment needs, how we deliver those services. And I think that is certainly stigma related as well. That is structural stigma in terms of how we've traditionally done that in this country. And so, so I think my intro is a little bit different, sort of thinking more critically about John's questions. I guess the other thing I would say as a policy researcher, my work is really focused on how stigma moves us away from policies that support people who use drugs or who have substance use disorder treatment needs, and how it moves us toward policies that criminalize and punish people who use drugs or have substance use disorder treatment needs. And I also just wanted to add that I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, so I wish this seminar or symposium was in person so I would have an excuse to come back to visit. But really excited to be here today and looking forward to the discussion. So thanks.
Hi, I'm Kathy Starkweather, and I want to thank you for inviting me to be a member of this panel. Appreciate it very much. I'm a non-academic. I am working with the Radar Center now. I've been working there since about August on a culturally based family intervention program with several Native American communities. Prior to that, I got a bachelor's in sociology from the University of Nebraska, and I worked for USDA as a rural sociologist, which was, nobody knew what a sociologist was, so they thought I was a psychologist. So interesting conversations there. But when I went into the work with USDA, my passion and my background have always been in social and racial justice and injustice. And it was kind of the perfect storm. Our new director it was an African-American male, and he wanted some analysis done on the diversity of the current staffing and the future staffing. And not surprising, that didn't turn out very well, but it was a real opportunity for me because I was taking some graduate classes, and one was in social psychology. And I was introduced to non-conscious or implicit bias during that. And I thought that this would be very good information to share with my agency at that point, because I think it really informed some of what was going on. At that same time, the Black Farmers of America filed a class action lawsuit against USDA for not having access to USDA programs. That was followed up by Hispanic Farmers of America, Native American Farmers of America, and Women Farmers of America. So I took the information that I learned in that class and I did much more research. I have a listing of the research and information that I gathered, materials I gathered from the experts, and tried to form that into information that could be shared in an understandable way, just with regular folks on the street. So trying to use that language, but also trying to explain it primarily with examples so people could take that home and do something with it. From there, so I held this training like in 40 states out of, all the states, but I will echo what John said. It was an easy check off the list of having done something in diversity. And so there was no real commitment to that, though I would say that USDA is much more diverse now than it was 25 years ago, for sure. From there, I went to work for the Center for Rural Affairs. And the Center for Rural Affairs is a nonprofit organization. I started out on their policy program as an organizer. So I got to see, how policy went from a seed of an idea to the other side where it was applied. But I also really wanted to do work in my areas of interest. So I took the position of the director of our rural programs, and we developed a lot of different programs that reach the most vulnerable, particularly minority beginning farmers and women beginning farmers, food justice, food access, food sovereignty. And then for the last several years, we introduced a program on inclusion as the demographic shift in many of the small towns in Nebraska had changed dramatically. In several communities where now the minority were the majority of those community members. So I'm coming at this from a lens of applying non-conscious bias. I think it's a very important component of what we're talking about. We talk about stigma because it, in fact, I think it make up our mind about people, what they do, what we perceive them to be doing, and what kind of people they are without knowing them is the basis of that, as you all know. But I think that there is much more to it. And I think that there needs to be not only policy, but there needs to be accountability within that policy that creates an environment, not only where it's well known and understood, but I think part of that policy has to be, and communication has to be at a level that people can really comprehend it. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Kathy. So my name is Scott Neufeld. I'm a PhD candidate here in Vancouver, British Columbia at Simon Fraser University. And yeah, I wanted to acknowledge as well that I'm coming to you here from the Indigenous territories, the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And that's an acknowledgement that we always do here. It's been asked of us by local Indigenous peoples. And it's important to connect to this conversation around stigma, overdose, substance use, especially in light of recent work that showed here in British Columbia, our province, that Indigenous peoples continue to be vastly represented and who is dying of overdose in this province. Just from January to May 2020, around 16% of all overdose deaths in this province were Indigenous people. They only make up about 3% of the province's population. And that, I think, is really important as a grounding to talk about stigma. And I want to just provide a little bit of background on what sort of my approach to this conversation, this topic has been. Most research on substance use stigma kind of falls into one of two categories. One is describing the experience and the correlates of stigma for people with lived experience of substance use. The other would be research on interventions to change, hopefully trying to reduce stigma towards people who use drugs. I see my own work as something a little bit more meta. Kurt Lewin is one of the founders of social psychology. He famously said that if you want to understand something, you should try to change it. And in my project, what we've been trying to do is to see how government, health authorities, and nonprofits understand the problem of stigma by looking critically at how they are trying to change stigma. So what we've been doing is a critical and systematic analysis of anti-stigma campaigns across Canada and the United States. And so I also want to point out that I'm a person without lived experience. I'm not a current or former user of illicit substances. I actually grew up in a predominantly white, suburban, rural community outside of Vancouver. I was very much steeped in stigma towards people who use drugs, especially folks who reside in Vancouver's notorious downtown east side neighborhood. But over the years, I've entered that specific community and in fact, that neighborhood in various ways. First, through my interest and sort of alarm as a social psychologist in seeing the really, as Kathy mentioned, we talk a lot about implicit bias. It's been the big topic of conversation, looking at racism and sexism in social psychology for many years now. But stigma towards people who use drugs is often extremely explicit in its dehumanization and its public expressions of just revulsion towards people who use drugs. And that struck me as just so different than the forms of stigma and prejudice that we look at typically in social psych. And so I sort of got interested in the area that way. But I started to meet folks who were in active use, longtime drug user advocates and activists in Vancouver. And through building those relationships and starting to understand more about the intersections of classism, of racism, of sexism towards people who use drugs, especially long-term users. And so I've been able to partner with some of these folks who've really taught me so much about the stigma that they experience on this project. Much has been said about the new face of addiction in media representations of the opioid overdose crisis in both Canada and the United States. If you've never checked, the new face of addiction is white, it's middle class, it's often female. And that is not who I'm researching with. We sometimes joke the folks that I'm working with represent the old face of addiction, the usual suspects, low income, racialized folks. But we've been looking at all of these anti-stigma campaigns. We've identified over 300 across the United States and Canada, the majority of those since 2017. We're looking at who are these for? Who is represented in these campaigns? What are the models of stigma that they're representing? And perhaps unsurprisingly, certainly unsurprising to my collaborators, they're really not about the old face of addiction. They're not for low-income, racialized people. I'll just give you an example in a kind of most close coding that I've been looking at in Canada, Canadian campaigns, over 100 that I've identified. There's around 77% of the focal individuals in these campaigns are represented as white people. Around 75% are represented as middle-class people. And these are really not groups that are overrepresented in the overdose crisis, as I mentioned before, in BC, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario. All of these provinces, Indigenous folks are overrepresented as dying of overdose, and they're very, very minimally represented in anti-stigma campaigns, just as one example. It's a little bit about my work. I'll pass it over to Austin, and looking forward to this discussion.
Hi, I'm Austin Brown. I'm currently at Syracuse University. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Maxwell School for Citizenship and Public Affairs. I'm an affiliated researcher at the Lerner Center for Public Health Promotion. My background is got a degree in psychology, master's in social work, and I'm currently studying to get a doctorate in social science. My interest really, I've done some research in this area. My interest is that I consider myself a recovery scientist, a recovery theorist, and one of the founding members of the Recovery Science Research Collaborative, which one of the things we've really tried to do is to keep people, particularly scientists who have experience in recovery and in addiction, as kind of the centerpiece of the people who are designing and defining the science of recovery. And one person in long-term recovery myself. My interests really are in the power and the politics that go into factors of identity, how these things play out, how we construct people through these social labels and these different schemas. You know, and asking the question of who has the authority to define who and under what contexts, and what the action of defining or stigmatizing people means politically, what it means socially, culturally. And, you know, who or what the stigma excludes or includes, right? So when we label people, there are parts that are left off and there are parts that are included. And I'm interested in both halves of that equation. And I'm interested in how this includes initiatives towards social justice, how it also may include things like neoliberal performative forms of social justice, you know, in lieu of things like deep, equitable, structural changes, so on and so forth.
Thank you, everyone. So I have 3 questions. I've circulated these in advance to give people a chance to think about them. And I'll ask one, give us about 12 minutes to talk about it amongst ourselves and then move on to the next one. So my first question is, what are the political implications of how we define stigma? Since Irving Goffman's 1963 book Stigma, there have been 2 main lines of stigma research characterized by different methodologies and understandings of stigma, one psychological and the other sociological. And of course, I think both are important. But in current US discussions of stigma, the psychological is largely won out. Most policy and popular discussions understand stigma as some vague combination of stereotype and implicit bias. I'd like us to reflect on the political implications of this definition. A psychological framing of stigma, for example, minimizes its relationship with the criminalization of addiction and therefore its intersectionality with anti-Black racism and other forms of oppression. Is the word stigma becoming a euphemism to describe the public health consequences of the drug war.
Excuse me, started to speak and then I coughed instead. I think that the political purpose that it serves is, and let me back up for a second. I think that the language and the way it's being looked at right now, the psychological aspect of that, well, the implicit bias aspect of that is, it's an easy, kind of an easy way out right now. I mean, it's, if you're not looking at the organizations that are making money selling this training, and you're looking at people who really understand it much more than I do, certainly, but there's much more to it than, you know, the top frosting of the cake that they like to share. And the bottom line is, and in the policy work that I used to do, people don't get that part of it. You know, there are so many people who are only looking at that policy, and they're not thinking of embedding the important component in it that addresses the stigma, addresses the implicit bias to that. And without that, and I say that because the easy part of that is that it's a fairly easily understandable concept, implicit bias. You know, you don't blame anybody for it. It's part of your brain. It's, you know, the way you take in the information, et cetera. And I think people are, because there's been more conversation around that in the last few years, it's people are grabbing onto that, public health, and others are just grabbing onto that. Well, we got the answer, let's go forward. And so I think there's going to be, need to be much more attention given to the true language, the inclusivity of everything that's involved, which is part of the problem, I think.
When thinking about this question, John, I felt like, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I feel like perhaps I misunderstand some of the psychological theory related to stigma, but I think what is helpful in bringing on the sociological conceptualization of stigma is that it engages this idea of power and hierarchies. And this allows us to sort of expand what the goals of stigma reduction are, to include kind of meaningful changes in access to housing and access to employment and reduce involvement in the carceral system. And I think while the psychological perspective is really important in understanding interpersonal interactions and the way that stigma manifests in those interactions and how stigma is internalized, and in sort of interpreting how causal explanations for addiction that treat it as permanent and as the responsibility of the individual elicit punitive or neglectful responses. The sociological perspective kind of gives us a little bit more precision in distinguishing who is stigmatized versus who is perceived negatively. So, you know, we don't view people working at social media companies right now very positively, or there seems to be sort of a movement towards sort of a more negative view of executives in Silicon Valley, but this is not a population that is stigmatized. They are not marginalized. They are powerful and they have political influence. And if we don't sort of engage that perspective, it's hard to distinguish between sort of negative perceptions and stigma.
I'll jump in here. The identity itself of somebody who is struggling with substances is probably one of the worst identities a person could have. And this is true cross-culturally and throughout the world, which I think is really troubling. And this goes all the way back to Odysseus and the island of the Lotus Eaters, right? The big danger there was that the men on the ship wouldn't engage in the things they needed to engage in if they ate of the lotus, right? So there's this idea that somehow anybody who uses substances fails in certain other ways, certain specific productive ways. And that ties right into the narrative of things like market systems, penal systems, so on and so forth. There's a double meaning that's kind of captured there, that stigma gives it hinges on the idea of personal responsibility, which is then systematized and then becomes solidified through these systems. And there's sort of a double meaning there, because when you marginalize one group through stigma, then it elevates certain people in certain systems to be able to stand at some sort of political position over and above this particular population. And this gets turned into things like clinicians knowing what's best, politicians knowing what's best, even the biomedical establishment knowing what's best. And so all of that gets tangled up into the politics of all of it.
If I could just jump in here. Thanks everybody for sharing that so far. A few things that I've noticed in my looking through, hundreds of anti-stigma campaigns or ways that states and governments are say that they're trying to address stigma, is definitely resonates with what John suggested, that the psychological has largely won out. And I say this as a social psychologist myself, that the vast majorities of stigma that I see on little, random public health department websites talking about the overdose crisis or substance use, is some kind of a hodgepodge of vaguely psychological terms like bias, stereotypes, discrimination, name calling. Like it's sort of just a big mix. And so it's a very vaguely defined term. But I think the key thing that I've noticed across so many examples of ways that states and governments are trying to address stigma is that they're very much almost entirely focused on that individual psychological level. And it almost seems as if stigma is it's very much located in people's heads, according to these definitions. That is a problem of individuals. And there's basically zero acknowledgement or discussion in these definitions or in these campaigns of the wider structural, systemic, sources of the criminalization of illicit substances leads to, and was it really intended as a stigmatization, a deterrent. It really ignores the intersections with racism and classism. Of the hundreds of campaigns that I've looked at, can count on one hand the amount that even mention any intersections with substance use stigma and racism or classism. So I think it's really important to think about the political implications of how we define stigma. And I absolutely agree that for the most part, it's a very apolitical definition that we have, very much treats substance use, people use drugs as these sort of identityless individuals, completely unsituated, out of context, as if your substance use is the only thing that determines your outcomes, when those are completely determined by the intersecting categories of race, class, gender, which are really not represented in most definitions of stigma that I see.
One of the challenges are we moving on to the next question? Or can I?
Go ahead, please.
Okay. I was just interested in sort of, I'm really excited when you publish or disseminate your work, Scott, to learn more about just what you've learned, because I don't feel like I have a good grasp of kind of the variety of these stigma-related campaigns that are ongoing throughout the US. And so I'm very curious to see your work in that space. One thing I wanted to mention is that, we do one of kind of the research techniques that our team uses in our work involves these randomized experiments in which we're manipulating different aspects of a narrative or some usually text-based message that someone might see in the news media, for instance, or in some other media, that it, to get a sense of sort of how that might be shaping their attitudes. And we're only measuring attitudes in these experiments. It's a limitation of that work. But in one experiment, we manipulated the socioeconomic status of a pregnant woman with opioid use disorder and found that some strategies that seem like they might be sort of stigma reducing in other contexts, like portraying treatment and recovery as possible. This is not permanent. This is not a permanent state of being. This don't work when the woman is portrayed as low socioeconomic status. And these are really tiny manipulations, like the woman lives in an apartment instead of a house. She rides public transportation instead of driving a car, that sort of thing. And it, I wanted to sort of underscore and the point you were making about classism and racism and the extent to which it intersects with stigma and how it's a real challenge, I think, for efforts that are focusing sort of solely on communication campaigns to, like, how do you manage that? Yeah, so I'll stop there.
I wanted to add as well, it's not useful to construct a new binary, right? To move from the psychological to the social. And I also think activists make the mistake that it can be really paralyzing when you're worried if your child is going to overdose tomorrow, or if you're asking how to get through the first couple months of recovery, to be told that we need to be talking about the social determinants of health can sound literally insane, right? So we always have to think about, well, how do we operationalize social determinants of health in a way that are meaningful for people who are trying to navigate these realities of addiction that we're seeing today? But so you get this response sometimes from activists, which is like, we shouldn't talk about stigma, we should talk about discrimination. But it's a false binary. When we look, our full understanding of stigma, it includes discriminatory actions, it includes institutions, it includes ideologies, it includes practices. And one can model that in different ways. And I think one needs multiple models of stigma. But the point I'd like to leave this discussion on is more complex stigma models give us more points of intervention. They open up the imagination to different levels we can intervene on, from the individual to the institutional, to the social. So whereas sometimes I think people hear discussion of structure or social determinant of health is paralyzing, in fact, in a way, they're kind of liberating, because they give us more avenues into addressing this question. But for the purpose of time, I'm going to move on to my second question. Is stigma reduction a clear and meaningful goal? Attempts to reduce public stigma against mental illness began in the late 1950s. And although there have been pockets of progress, decades of research and campaigns have produced modest or negative results. Most strategies of stigma reduction described in the literature for substance use disorders show slight to moderate effects and do not sustain beyond 6 months. Most don't sustain beyond 3 months. The stigma reduction strategy most strongly embraced by the federal government, emphasizing addiction and a disease, has been repeatedly shown to have mixed or negative outcomes from a stigma perspective. And that's set aside if you think the disease model of addiction is scientifically accurate. That's not what I'm raising here. Simply calling addiction a disease actually tends to have negative stigma implications. Other popular anti-stigma interventions, for example, the huge social messaging media campaigns that Rhode Island continues to pour money into, are supported by very uneven research, if they're supported at all. I would go so far to say when a campaign against SUD stigma describes itself as evidence-based, it is stretching the meaning of this word to a breaking point. In living memory, the most successful effort to destigmatize a socially marginalized illness, HIV/AIDS, was not produced through these types of interventions. It occurred through a shift in US culture regarding homophobia and queer rights, produced by a mass social movement, and this change, as everyone knows on this call, is highly uneven. It is worth asking if stigma reduction is a clearly defined enough concept to be a meaningful public health goal. Do we need stigma reduction or do we need culture change?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I think having looked at a lot of those big social messaging campaigns now, it's such a bizarre field to be working in, just to see how much effort is and expense and resources are being put into these large scale attempts, which, as I think Aline, you're familiar with Barry and McGinty. I don't know their first names, but I know that they just published this paper in NEGM. And they're saying, we really don't know that much about what works in the stigma reduction field here. Here's a few things that we know, but they have this quote that I think is so important to understand, which is that the vast majority of interventions trying to reduce stigma are not based in evidence. They're based in people's intuitions. And for that reason, they provide a sort of interesting data point in themselves, because they reveal how people's kind of gut reactions, how do they think stigma works, and how do they think it can change in the absence of evidence. So I really agree with what you say, John. I think culture change seems like a more viable or meaningful goal, but I think something to think about here too is that often a lot of campaigns or interventions trying to reduce stigma, somewhat maybe ignoring all of the ways that we continue to produce stigma. All of the political campaigns that very much trade on the fears, law and order, often scapegoating people who use drugs, people with mental health challenges, as this source of danger that the powerful politician is going to put you against. Absolutely, just diving down onto the stigma, not not even thinking about reducing it. Like, stigma is useful, it's valuable for people with power, and I think we ignore that to our peril when we're thinking about how we might reduce it, if we're not also focusing on how we can stop producing and perpetuating stigma.
Yeah, I would echo some of that for sure. I think the question becomes, where do we want to spend our energy? At the same time, we're talking about a population that has been stigmatized and marginalized for a long, long time. So one of the things that I think gets overlooked is how resilient the community is, and how resilient people that have this issue are. And I think that gives us a little bit of the ability to relax a little bit. The question becomes, who are we trying to reduce the stigma for? Are we trying to reduce the stigma for suburban white individuals who are afraid to seek help, right? Or are we trying to reduce stigma so that doctors will prescribe medication, in higher volumes? So it really becomes a question of who are we trying to reduce the stigma for, and to what ends? I think that the study, the research, the knowledge production around stigma is valuable. I think it should run parallel, and that things like language, for example, language is a moving target, and so what's clinical today will be pejorative tomorrow. And so there has to be a consistent way of producing knowledge about what's in and what's out, around language. And that should run parallel to whatever research we're doing. And then we should be using the latest terms and all of that in journalism and in science and all of that. But as far as cultural change, I mean, we're talking about something that is deeply, deeply rooted into a lot of other aspects of things that we assume to be true in our society. So when we talk about cultural change, we're talking about, productive people that are productively participating in market systems, people that are able to own property, people that are able to follow laws, right? So all of this stuff is embedded in that. And so can we can we work around the edges of that, or do we need to address those things specifically and scientifically? And that's a really valid question. I think that the cultural shift, if there is a cultural shift, it has to come from the community itself. It involves a lot of the reclamation of things like pejorative language and stuff like that. When the HIV, the rise of HIV and AIDS activism and all of that is a really useful roadmap, I think, in this particular area.
Yeah, I mean, I think stigma reduction is an incredibly important goal, and I don't know that I think it's distinct from cultural change. I think that sort of would be an outcome of that would demonstrate that stigma reduction has occurred. But I agree sort of that there's little consensus on what outcomes are meaningful measures of stigma reduction. Changes in attitudes, not sufficient, and may not sort of tell us from a research perspective whether or not stigma is truly declining or whether people perceive that it's no longer socially acceptable to express these attitudes. And so there's some social desirability bias in terms of how they answer questions on surveys, for instance. But I think I think it relates a little bit to your next question, so I won't jump ahead, but I think sort of meaningful stigma reduction means meaningful changes in the quality of life for people who use drugs and who experience substance use disorder. So stigma reduction is only an important goal to the extent that it enables that. In terms of some of your questions about kind of organizing and the role of organizing in stigma reduction, I think I think it's an opportunity. I think I'm looking at it from a research perspective, but I think it's an opportunity for a partnership to get a sense of kind of what organizing strategies are working. And so we recently did some qualitative interviews with activists around the country who are involved in organizing to facilitate sanctioned supervised consumption sites in the US, which currently, they're only underground supervised consumption sites. And it was interesting to sort of learn about the different strategies these organizers and activists were using to engage different communities and their messaging strategies. I mean, they're confronting stigma and NIMBYism in the communities in which they're working. And so I think like thinking on a small scale about strategies that are working at a local level in communities would be helpful, and that's sort of like an outcome that we could look at as a meaningful measure of stigma reduction. And then again, because I'm a policy researcher, I think about like the federal parity law, and even though we face major failures in terms of adequate enforcement, that was passed in 2008, and that was a major achievement if you're thinking about stigma reduction. And so I think we should think broadly about what we mean by stigma reduction and what sorts of outcomes are important. Oh, and then I guess one more point, sorry to add, is just I think one sort of another really tangible way to think about stigma reduction is medication stigma reduction, opioid agonists, specifically medication stigma reduction. And that can maybe still seem like kind of less overwhelming. I mean, that's something where it's, I think, a little bit easier to think about what outcomes would be meaningful, which is anyone with opioid use disorder who wants medication is able to get it. And so I think maybe sort of being a little bit more precise or narrow in terms of what we're talking about could be helpful.
Kathy, did you want to add something here?
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to actually ask me. I've just been thinking a lot about all the comments that were just made. And I don't think that stigma reduction itself is very clear or very meaningful. And what Aileen, am I pronouncing your name right, Aileen? just said, and I think Austin mentioned it too, is this idea of the power structure, and it is in place for a reason. I mean, I don't mean that the power structure is in place for a reason, but the stigma is in place for a reason. And that is to continue the power dynamics. The stigma coming at it from a point of view where equity issues are maybe more focused on safe housing for people and access to the proper not only medication, but health opportunities. Those kinds of things, I think it'd be like a backdoor way to address the stigma, just because if you own a house, the pride that you feel in that, if you've never done that before or had one and then lost it because, you know, of situations that you're facing right now, being able to do that not only does something for that individual, but it also does something for the people who are judging them or putting the stigma on them. And so that's just, instead of the focus so much on how are we going to fix the stigma, how are we going to change the culture, because those are really big rocks. And, you know, coming at it from maybe that backdoor perspective that policy can address.
I think all of that makes a lot of sense. Scott and I were earlier talking some today over email about a shift in from addressing attitudes to behaviors. What are moving, and locally, this is some of what we've talked about in stigma research, thinking that sexual harassment actually might be a better model to think about stigma reduction. You set new norms and you create consequences for violating those norms, and then you inculcate them in a culture of a workplace. Like, instead of changing people's underlying bias, identify what's discriminatory behavior and enable people to challenge it. So, and I think that's the conversation is going that direction in a number of places. I also think stigma overlaps with some other problems that it often gets conflated with. One is medical mistrust. A lot of people when they talk about stigma around medication for opioid use disorders, there's a lot of stigma, but there's also a lot of deep distrust amongst historically marginalized communities who have every reason not to trust the healthcare system or doctors or pharmaceuticals. Is that best conceptualized as stigma? Is that best conceptualized as mistrust? We probably need to address both. And I also worry about how much stigma is rooted in trauma and secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. That often the most egregious instances of stigma I see are amongst poorly paid frontline workers working 4-day, 12-hour shifts, whose brother died of an overdose and who's, you know, has no training and sees people like me only at our worst every day for years. And, you know, if we're going to attack those people from stigma, it becomes a real form of victim blaming, right? Actually, it's really about where they work in the system and their own trauma that's driving a lot of these responses. So my final question, which we've already gotten into a little bit, but is whose responsibility is it to transform stigma? So I think the recent efforts by Dr. Nora Valkov and others to place stigma at the center of the national discussion are very important and welcome. At the same time, a lot of us notice that there's a big silence in these interventions, which is they give absolutely no role to people who use drugs or people in recovery in challenging or transforming stigma. And I want to say that this is internationally anomalous. That if you look especially in Europe and something like the UK's Time to Change campaign, which is a 13-year, £5 billion campaign, which is probably, I wonder what Scott thinks, but I think it's probably the most successful international example of a stigma campaign. It was originated through focus groups with people with lived experience. Its interventions were designed in collaboration with people with lived experience. Its leadership contains people with lived experience, and it's evaluated by people with lived experience, right? It's at every level. there's not just CABs, community advisory boards. I'm starting to become very, I mean, that's another discussion, but people have power, right? People with lived experience have actual power over developing and implementing these campaigns. And of course that comes down to, they have access to money as well. So, it seems to me that the lack of agency for people who use drugs and people in recovery within our discussion about stigma is it's self-profoundly stigmatizing. And as a colleague of mine at Rikers, Diego sometimes puts it, what would it look like if we stopped trying to get into doctors' heads or therapists' heads or police officers' heads and started to try to empower their patients or the people who are actually the objects of stigma? What would that shift entail?
So I'll start off. The work we did on, we did some work on labels and how individuals label themselves and under what context. And one of the things that really emerged from that was the idea that, people in recovery, for example, know that the way they identify, say, in a 12-step meeting is not how they should identify at work. And so to remove kind of the autonomy from that and to say, that, or to assume that people are not able to manage their own identities across different contexts in the way that they label themselves is really disempowering, right? So giving people the sort of the benefit of the doubt that, this is their experience. So it's not just around recovery. It's not just around using substances, but it's around how cops treat you. It's around how the therapist talks to you. It's around the things you see on TV that don't really represent your experience. All of those things, if you simply ask somebody and do so in a scientific way, would come to light. And so the question becomes, where do we get our information from? And one of the things that I've always thought is an extension of stigma and marginalization is the failure to ask. The failure to ask the people who've survived, the failure to ask the people who still struggle, how they think and feel about all of these concepts. Because their input is really the substrate from which you can create all different types of new interventions, new types of systems, the way people label themselves. All of that can come from sitting down and having a discussion with the population in question, which if we look at the use of critical race theory in public health, for example, there's multiple levels of engagement where you have to be, you have to involve the idea that this stuff is already systematized. It has to be approached through multiple different levels. But the engagement centers on this idea that the stigma already exists and the population already exists, and there's a relationship there that can be studied and can be altered based on the terms in which it already exists through knowledge production and various other things.
This also as people are thinking about answers, gets into some of the questions we've gotten in the chat about what are practical things people can do? What are small scale things people can do as well?
Just to build off of that a little bit, yeah, I think this emphasis on empowering, increasing opportunities for people with lived experience themselves to identify, to name, and to challenge their own dehumanization. I think that feels really centrally important. Martin Luther King kind of famously said, freedom's not voluntarily given by the oppressor. It's got to be demanded by the oppressed. I think it's unrealistic to expect that we should, wait around for the state or health authorities or doctors or people with power to, decide that stigma needs to change and we should change policies to help people. I think we've started to see some of the edges of that. And from what I can see and how that unfolds, it's not great in terms of who it's for, who it includes and who it excludes. So I think if we want to see more equitable, more structural focused, intersectionally focused stigma change, we should be supporting grassroots movements, of people with lived experience that are trying to resist their own exclusion. And I have seen a number of examples of campaigns that are trying to do this in some ways. That there are more than just Time to Change in the UK that have, built their campaigns out of focus groups with people with lived experience. I think the type of people with lived experience is always an important question. I mean, people who are represented as in recovery is certainly a subset of people that show up in anti-stigma campaigns. From the Canadian campaigns that I've coded and looked at, it's around 12% of the focal individuals are represented as people in recovery. The vast, the other really big chunks of people are friends and family members of people who have, either overdosed or struggle with substance use. There's a lot of service providers in anti-stigma campaigns, experts, doctors, mayors, people who have some take on stigma, but it's always a specific take. And from what I can see, a lot of the times, the ways that these campaigns that are developed, funded by people with power represent the problem of stigma is not super inclusive. It's sort of anti-stigma for people that already have a lot of social, racial, economic privilege.
I think that's a really interesting question about sort of who is depicted in campaigns that feature people. And then I think also like involving people in recovery and involving people in active use. And then sort of, distinguishing between those and cases in which sort of that may ebb and flow a bit is challenging. And I raise that because I haven't really been involved on the intervention development side or implementation side until this past year, when Hopkins decided that as part of a broader effort to try to reduce overdose in Baltimore, it was making a number of changes in the hospital system. And one element of it was going to be sort of a stigma reduction campaign. And when we did sort of this workshop with people to think through sort of different messaging strategies that could be included in this campaign, one of the participants, who is someone who identifies as in recovery, made the important critique that there was no one in the room who was actively using. And that person's experience is very different in the hospital from someone who's in recovery. And so that was an important sort of perspective missing. And that, I think that's like, has more to do with sort of involvement at a very basic level and not these broader issues you're raising, John, about sort of leadership and having like a really meaningful role that like has some heft in terms of determining like the direction the campaign or the intervention or the effort or whatever it is goes. There was one other thought I had related to this issue. And then I think also I just wanted to mention sort of that effort. I think, it is in kind of concert with some sort of other structural changes in the hospital. So hiring peers, someone pointed out, may be more stigma reducing than this communication campaign. And so yes, I mean, I think like what is the point of stigma reduction if the people who are stigmatized don't feel that there is some sort of meaningful improvement? I said that earlier, but I just think that has to be sort of a central theme in all of these efforts or campaigns or whatever, or interventions or whatever sort of form or structure they take.
The only thing that I would add to this conversation is I think it's always important for grassroots activity and involving the people who are living the experience, because otherwise I can't think of anything more dehumanizing than being someone who is using drugs and everybody just keeps either treating me a certain way or prescribing certain medications, or we've got the program and we're going to focus on this, that's going to make your whole life better. You know, having people, I really liked what you said, Elena, about having peers come in and talk with people who are in the hospital. That kind of thing can go a long way toward helping the individual feel less dehumanized and more an active member, respected member of society. And doing this on a grassroots, small scale level might be a good way to start. And involving people and family members too. I think that Austin said that. I think that that's really important because they're seeing it from a different perspective. And if you can get people in the room and talking about this, how are we going to change this system? I think it can get some legs.
We have time for one or two more questions. One, Dave has asked, what do we think, and Austin's actually done some research on this, about when people in recovery knowingly leverage stigmatized language and concepts to help frame their own recovery with certain audiences to get back some of the power and respect they've lost.
Yeah, I think that pejorative reclamation of stigmatizing languages is it's praxis, right? Like it's a political act, and it can be an empowering one. I think that is something that maybe is not well understood outside of that sphere all the time, which produces the opportunity for things like stigmatizing terms to be taken up outside of the context in which they were used. But, you know, there's an inherent risk in that. But, you know, it's not the only population to ever reclaim a pejorative label and to empower themselves with it. So, I mean, I think it's important. I think the way people talk about themselves casually on the street, the way they talk about themselves at home with friends, out doing whatever they do. I mean, that's important because that's the tissue from which their reality is constructed. And so understanding what that is and what it means to them, to me, takes precedence over whatever definition I may be able to write and publish in some sort of journal somewhere. So that's kind of my thoughts on it.
We were going. I want to let Ken, who we put up on the screen, ask a question. He early on posed a question about race and intersectionality, which I think we've touched on, but is so central to every aspect of this discussion. Yeah, I'd like to hear more of what he has to say. Ken, can you talk?
If we're Ken Wakabayashi, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay.
Sorry, I was away from the computer for a little bit. Yes, I was reading through the chat and so I was curious about this intersection between language, stigmatization, and sort of race, because as someone who's done preclinical addiction research over the years, I've noticed that there's a sort of very different framing in the media, for example, and in the culture when they talk about, let's say, white addicts, usually popular entertainers, having a battle or struggle, a brave struggle, and they lose and then they die. And then that kind of heroic language is almost never used in a non-white context. And so this isn't really my area of research. So I was curious as to whether or not I was sort of only doing this or noticing this anecdotally, or is this something that is actually really systemic? And I was wondering what your thoughts were on this particular issue and how this informs attitudes of stigma.
Thanks, Ken. I think that's a really, really important observation. And yeah, you're certainly not the first person to notice that. There's a lot of great real literature that's out there. I'd especially recommend work by Helena Hansen and colleagues in New York, who've really looked systematically across media representations of the overdose crisis, the opioid crisis, sometimes referred to as yeah, and find a lot of that same kind of different framing depending on who is represented as, someone who matters, who's someone who uses drugs, or someone who's overdosed. And very much there's this narrative that, people of privilege, people that are white, people that are middle upper class, accidentally fell into addiction. It was no fault of their own. It was the fault of the overprescribing of the doctor. It was the back injury. And that narrative is not as often extended to people of color. The narratives are often more focused on criminalization, their bad morals, their just involvement in crime, this kind of thing. I mean, I think there's lots of different discussions of the reasons for that. Arguably there are equally externally attributable narratives that we could tell about why people from marginalized communities experience addiction that have to do with really things that we don't often like to talk about in national conversations, like legacies of racism, the after effects of slavery, of impoverished communities, of colonization, of land theft, of genocide. And so perhaps just stigmatizing those communities and saying their substance use is because of their bad morals is a protect ourselves as dominant society from all of the atrocities that we've collectively committed.
I know we're at time, but we wanted to allow one last question. So Leslie Wood, are you still here?
Yeah, hi. I don't necessarily have my thoughts all together. This has been really interesting to watch, but it kind of seems like stigma reduction is a bit futile in the face of the continued war on drugs. And I'm wondering whether you guys think policy changes, like I know that Oregon has decriminalized, but I think that's kind of maybe increasing racial disparities in health when we focus on white stigma reduction, but we don't seem to have a way to get the voices of those who have been incarcerated and those who have been attacked in the war on drugs for the past 5 decades. So any thoughts on that and how we could change policy instead of changing stigma?
I'll just say I absolutely agree that criminalization puts an extremely low ceiling on any stigma efforts. I think you can do some things locally, but unless you address the war on drugs, and there's very little you can do ultimately to shift the culture. And I think we need to start calling out forcefully any discussion of stigma that does not put the war on drugs or the intersection with anti-Black racism at the center of it. At this point, after Oregon, people who do that are consciously avoiding the key question here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a time to storm the Bastille, right? Where decriminalization and letting people out that are in there for charges. I mean, that would be the best possible case scenario, and I think we have a right to demand it.
And last comments from Aline or Kathy?
Sure. I guess I would just say I think it's really hard to do work in substance use research if you aren't engaging issues related to criminalization and the needs of people who have suffered as a result of the war on drugs. And so I agree. I think engaging in those conversations is just a critical element. And of course, racism is part of that as well, given its disproportionate impacts on Black populations in the US in particular. And so I guess I would just say I agree. I don't think it's in terms of kind of hopefulness around it. I don't know what to say, but I do feel like there is sort of a greater acknowledgement and sort of willingness to engage with those issues, at least in the academic space. So fingers crossed.
I would just echo my agreement of the question and the response to that question. I think the policy aspect is so important. I think, recognizing the fact about how racialized it has become, and there are real issues. And I feel like, I think you said at the very beginning, John, that there is starting to become a little bit more conversation around this issue on a national scope. I mean, the very fact that we had, the newly elected folks talk about systemic racism, and as I think it was you too, John, who talked about Hunter Biden, but his, father even being able to say that, even though it sounds ludicrous because it seems like a normal thing, it's still being talked about. And those are the cracks that we're seeing in being able to actually do something, I think.
So I want to thank you all. I want to thank you for engaging with my challenging questions. I appreciate it, and thank the people who invited all of us for what's so far been a great week of events. Tomorrow morning, there's going to be a kind of coffee hour of meet and greet, different people who are both attendees and presenters. So if you can join that, that'd be an opportunity for some more informal discussion around this week's events. Have a good night, everyone.